Well, I wanted to talk today about one purpose of rhetoric based on my reading of a text that I'm using in my Intro to Rhetoric class. It's the Hauser, Gerard Hauser's Introduction to Rhetorical Theory, and it's a good text, but of course, any text that we interact with, we should be a little bit skeptical of and have an open mind. But the first chapter has a significant concept in it that I quite like. It's called the eventfulness of rhetoric, and Hauser makes a distinction between things, events, and processes or processes as a kind of, um, I guess, a sort of ontology, as a kind of way of describing everything that happens in the world. It's a sort of philosophy of being. So there are things which have, he says, sensible qualities, so physical, material reality. And now that's tricky when you really, if you get into some of the ideas from quantum theory, when we see, electrons jumping from at a very small scale, at the subatomic scale, the world is much less stable than it seems to be. But at least from our subjective perspective, there's a kind of material continuity to things, and we can describe those things in language. I have a blue coffee thermos here, and it is such a length, and that length, does not change in relation to a discrete unit, something like that. It's so many inches long, so on and so on. So this is a thing, right? This is a thing for Hauser. And then what Hauser puts in relationship to things are events. And I like this, really. So events occur. This is a sentence from the Hauser book here, page 4 of his Introduction to Rhetorical Theory. Just events occur. That's a nice sentence, and this is true, I think. And he goes on to talk about the arbitrary nature of, I call these complex systems. So you think about Newtonian physics, you can absolutely describe, say, how a projectile is going to travel through the air, where it's going to land, the arc it's going to take, if you know the mass and the velocity and the force involved. You have equations to describe these sorts of things. It's how we got to the moon, right? It's how you get a rocket through space. It's how you land a rover on Mars, because there are certain, say, predictable ways that the universe responds to force. And there are situations where that changes, and that's a lot of interesting work in cosmology, is, say, what happens around a black hole or something like that. But, for the sake of conversation, Newtonian physics will essentially, if you really know all of the factors involved, you can, say, predict where an object is headed, and that's really interesting. But as soon as you add in social actors, humans, who are unpredictable, as long as you don't, say, subscribe to a kind of deterministic theory of, say, the mind, you assume humans have a degree of free will and are free agents to act in the world and interact with others. You can't reasonably predict what's going to happen when you put two or more people in a room. What are they going to talk about? What will they do to each other? Will violence occur? Will they reach some kind of understanding? There's like almost an infinite number of possibilities of what can occur in an event. And this is maybe why, this is the case for rhetoric, is like rhetoric is the study of persuasion, but also our use of symbols and language, and what happens in these eventful situations that cannot be described by, say, the physical laws of the universe. It's concerned with what's happening in arbitrary domains of the social sphere and in civilization, and then into the realm of the political too. It's like, how do we take a system we don't understand and may never understand? This is my contribution here too, is and my critique too a little bit of Hauser is like, there are certain complex systems that we might eventually map out fully. We might, say, even if it's 1,000 years from now, we may finally have the mathematics and the computing algorithms to determine what is, say, an ideal economic system for a certain, for certain parameters that we plug into it. Like for we'll say, the perfect economic system for a Midwestern city of 20,000 people with, and you plug in all the data for every certain data points for every individual that lives in that area, and their religion and their ideology and their preferences and what kind of food do they want to eat. So maybe, right? Maybe. I don't want to throw that out the window, that at some point we might be able to describe complex systems in ways that we're not currently able to describe complex systems, whether that's because of great advancements in computational power, or we develop new theories to think about, say, economics, or develop new theories to think about these arbitrary events and the way that individuals interact with each other. It might be, and right, it's dangerous because I don't have a deterministic sense of the world. I feel like I have at least a degree of free will, and you probably feel like you have a degree of free will as well. To what extent is that, though, determined by everything that's occurred to us in our lives and the composition of our minds and so on. But anyway, this is why I like the study of rhetoric, particularly because it helps give us insight into the kinds of complex interactions and systems that occur in the world that cannot be described by, say, the sciences with any reliability, the hard sciences, right? And maybe at some point they will be, but rhetoric gives us this insight and a kind of toolkit, a way of thinking about how humans interact with one another in these arbitrary domains that we've constructed. And this is another point that I like very much, any thinker or philosopher who brings attention to the arbitrary, because this is a key sort of point in my own thinking that I don't think can be overlooked, is the arbitrary nature of so many of the methods and media and ways of being that we've built as humans, language. But even there, that's sticky. If you read the Chomsky stuff on universal grammar, you look at a baby has, an infant has so many phonemes that they can utter. And it seems like across the world, all infants utter the same set of phonemes. So there's like a universal base set of phonemes that are uttered within the first couple, 2 years of a child's birth, and then depending on where they're geographically located, that set of phonemes narrows down into the phonemes that are utilized in the language that the child is surrounded by. So this is quite interesting. So anyway, whether that's like to what extent that's, say, biological or learned, or that's not fully understood. But there are a number of arbitrary systems that we've invented. So, say, systems of capital, and exchange and monetary value, and even, say, the way that we set up, we build our dwellings in a certain arbitrary fashion. Architecture has no, and again, only to a degree. Like there are certain, say, non-essential pieces of architecture, non-essential functions of architecture that are just stylistic, and then there are functions of architecture that have utility, like some houses are built in such a way to withstand weather better. Some of them are built in, say, the siding that you put on your house, you might choose for an economic reason because vinyl is cheaper than some other material, or maybe if you put composite siding on your home, it's like that's going to wear down really quickly, but it's cheaper, so you might make that decision. That's different than, say, you build a house in a certain location because it's above the floodplain or something like that. So anyway, there are like arbitrary elements of almost everything we do, and then there are some elements of what we do that are, say, rooted in a kind of utility or a practicality or scientific, say, or based on what we predict to be happening in the future based on previous experience, which is a lot of what science does, I think, actually, is like documenting and trying to replicate phenomena in the world and systems in the world and describe those systems, and in so much as that it'll happen again, and in some way that will assist us because we now have described something that occurs in the world that we assume will happen again based on its replicability. It actually helps us survive and live in the world and then create, say, new technology, because we can predictably see how certain pieces of the world are going to interact with one another. So that's kind of a role of science. But what am I getting at? I like Hauser's Hauser talking about the relationship between arbitrary systems and just the arbitrary nature of so much that we do. Like money is invented, right? We know this. There's no gold standard anymore. And so with complex arbitrary systems, it can be helpful because they're not rooted in something predictable, empirical, always not always rooted. Arbitrary components of the world are not always rooted in something replicable or reliable or predictable. Rhetoric is an avenue to think about the arbitrary interactions or the interactions of what is arbitrary in the world, and to kind of better harness and utilize symbols and language and media and that are arbitrary that we have created. So a little couple of interesting points from the Hauser. He also talks about in this first chapter processes or processes. I like the kind of pronunciation of processes. It sounds so much more fancy and formal, but processes, as I always grew up. So Hauser says things have sensible qualities, events occur, and processes are continuous. They consist of sequential developments that involve changes. In general, we characterize these changes as causes and effects. So yeah, I think about this in terms of like, I think more in terms of like procedures. I've read, really appreciated Bagost's procedural rhetoric work, and I think more in terms of systems rather than processes. And I wish there were some more examples in the text exactly of I don't exactly know what he's getting at here. This example on the next page, there are times when we talk of processes in terms of events, and when we talk of events in terms of processes. So what is he saying? A rainstorm happens, the rain causes the river and lakes to rise, the water overflows, there's a flood, property damage, all sorts of things happen and after the storm. So then we have to think about how are people going to interact and fix all of these losses, and there's different systems that are interacting here. I'm not exactly sure what he's getting at in this passage, but we'll leave that for another video. I'll have to read that more closely. Certainly, and in my own thinking, I think of this in terms of systems. Like, so there's, if we, again, thinking about ontology, like what is our philosophy of, what, like the construct, how is the world constructed in a sort of way? What is it? How do things be in the world and that sort of thing? Hauser's talking about things, events, and then I would say systems, just so it makes more sense to me. And like a thing is a discrete thing, and then an event is here's a thing in the world. It's a discrete object that has material reality. That's fine. That's fine. I take a sip of the coffee. That's an event. That's an action occurring in the world that takes place over time, which is a phenomenological observation as well. All things are bound by the necessary or the happenstantial physical realities of the universe that we live in. So everything's pulled along in linear time. So action occurs over time, and all action and all events everything seems to occur necessarily over being pulled along by time. It's one of the dimensions of reality that we live in. So that's an event. I take a sip of the coffee. And then the systems that I think about, and this is really interesting, I think, it's like, what are the systems in place that led this to be created in the first place? Where did these plastics come from? Who are the people that worked at the factory that, and how did they get to the factory to operate the machinery that puts these things together? And then who grew the coffee beans, and how did they get to the US in the first place? And then who built the coffee pot? Like, these are these complex systems of interaction that at some point, I think, as mentioned earlier in this video, we might be able to describe in greater detail. And I think that might be a key to a new sort of technology that can really computate what might be ideal governmental or economic scenarios. Now, of course, there's always dangers with every algorithm. We're seeing that quite a bit now. We're inventing technologies that we don't quite understand yet, but I think eventually we might be able to describe complex systems with much more, more of a finite. But there may always be systems that it's just the resources don't exist to compute ideal scenarios for them. And so rhetoric serves that purpose of allowing an individual and allowing groups to navigate those sorts of complex, arbitrary social scenarios, and it's a very powerful tool. This video here, this is just one case for rhetoric. This is just one. I talk about the utility of rhetoric in my class quite a bit, and I'm sure I'll discuss some other ways that it serves a kind of function and a purpose in the world. And language makes you powerful. Harnessing language in a meaningful way makes you powerful. It can increase your income and your livelihood, and it can help you think through the world in ways that you might not otherwise be able to. So that's enough for now. Have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.